announced yesterday. We, as the Minara Chamber of Commerce, we are very interested in what happens in our country in terms of the politics, which will lay the economic landscape. And to help us unpack some of the scenarios and the implications, we are joined by a very august panel of experts. We have Dr. Imran Bacchus, who is an academic and he's a political analyst based here in Durban, and who has a great pulse, a feel of the pulse of what happens in terms of politics. And we've had great interactions with him. And he's always called on as an analyst by various media. We're also joined by Mr. Julius Kleinhans, who is the executive manager for local government at the organization OTA. And of course, joining us is Rashad Amra, who is an economist in the public economy with the Wits University. And he's also with the Southern Unit for Inequality Studies. So we gentlemen, good evening. And this has been a kind of let's say a tenterhook excitement time. Possibly as many analysts have pointed out, the most exciting elections that have taken place in the last 30 years. We've seen a great deal of enthusiasm by political parties, new entrants into the political field, various new political party formations, breakaways, and new formations as well. Trying to contest, at the last count was 52 parties trying to contest for the 400 seats in the national parliament. We've had three ballots, the national, the regional, and the provincial ballot. IEC has been fraught with various complaints that have been brought forward to it. And these seem to be some very exciting times. But I must say that I'm proud as a South African that we've been through an election that has garnered so much of interest from across the globe. There's been so much of information, misinformation, and disinformation around these elections, but we've come out on the other side of these elections relatively in a peaceful manner, where people have respected the law. We've seen that our constitution has been upheld. There's the processes that are in place. And I'm proud as a South African that we've managed to get through these elections where we've seen a majority party lose its majority and has taken that on the chin without so much as any fall back on it. And so I think that that's something that as South Africans must be celebrated. Imran, we've seen some great excitement. We've seen new political formations. We've seen a return of an old politician into the political sphere. I must say that the performance of the MK and Jacob Zuma has been quite astounding. It's something that has caught many analysts by surprise. It's caught seasoned politicians by surprise, that this widespread support that has come out and the kind of voting pattern that we have seen across Jacob Zuma and the MK. Now, to broadly look at it, this dramatic change in the political landscape, we're now looking in coalition politics, and it's something new. It's a new area for South Africa. What are the implications in our country, Imran? If you can unpack for us, what's the implication at the national level? What happens in terms of the various formations that are taking place? What's your view on the pulse as we see it?
Thanks, Imran. Assalamu alaikum to you, the panelists, and the audience. Well, thanks for inviting me. So I think the easy way to do it would be, I know many of us have been following the elections quite closely, so it might not make sense to talk about things you already know. But let me just make 3 or 4 points that I think are really important, and sort of analytical points, because we already know what the results are. I think the first point to make is what has occurred in this election is not at all surprising in terms of the result of the African National Congress particularly. Of course, the one surprise might be, like you alluded to, is the enormous support for MK. Why would I suggest that the decline of the ANC is not surprising at all? Because if you look at political science, but if you also look at the trajectory of the global south, liberation movements tend to get pushed to the periphery 3, 4, 5 decades into liberation. Of course, you might point out that Ghana was the exception, 10 years. But if you look at Kenya, if you look at Zambia with UNIP and 1992, if you look at KANU in Kenya, And if you look at several other liberation movements, this tends to be the trajectory. The one exception we might point out, might be the Mexican liberation movement, which stayed in power for about 7 decades. Of course, some of you might very quickly point out, what about our neighbors, Frelimo and SWAPO? Yes, of course, you're right. Frelimo's in power for 49 years now. Well, SWAPO's a lot newer. But of course, the controversial questions we can ask about Frelimo is, when they go to the elections in October, will they win the elections or will they steal the elections? The same with ZANU. So I think that's the first point, that liberation movements reach this point. The aura of liberation wears out. And I think all of these romanticized constructions of what liberation means wears out. Essentially, what that means is, you and I might romanticize and talk in romantic terms about how long someone was on Robben Island or who was tortured and who was in prison. But if you talk to younger people today, that aura has worn out. They don't necessarily care. What they do care about is the streetlights working, the potholes being fixed, and they want jobs, right? So I think that's the one point we're at. Of course, many of us expected, and Abraham, feel free to cut me off if I'm rambling on. Of course, the one point is many of us expected the ANC to do better because we sort of sensed that there was a moral rejuvenation in the ANC, right? And yes, we were right. And the point historically might be that the ANC has been through this moment of moral rejuvenation several times. It's not just with suddenly rising up to the genocide happening in Palestine. So if I can just quickly point out those points of moral rejuvenation, 1912 might be the one, the response to 1910, the Union, African nationalism responding to, if you like, white nationalism. In the 60s at Morogoro, in the 80s at Kabwe, and of course, several other points. And for us, the ANC's response to Palestine, I think, has been reassuring, uplifting, etc. But I think, too little, too late, perhaps. And I think many of us were fooled into believing that there's this idea of a Muslim vote, and somehow a Muslim vote will rescue the ANC. That's the one. The other is that in the context of unemployment, poverty, the cruelty of disparity, etc. And I might also point out the vulgarity of capital. Think of Sandton and the juxtaposition with Alex Township, or Umhlanga and Amawoti Township, right? So in that context, people do get disillusioned. They reject the political establishment, and they look for what we call authoritarian populism. And
Imran, prior to this election, we've seen, you pointed out about the youth, and you pointed out about the issues that society has faced, and this kind of understanding that there's actually two parts of our voter demographic. Those that were the pre-1994 that are voting for the mere reason that they didn't have the vote previously, and so they exercise that right of vote purely because of the passion of not having it previously. And then you have the next generation who are voting on issues that they are facing. And so they don't have that emotional attachment to the 1994 generation as such. And you point that out very nicely in terms of the youth demographic. But we've seen a sense in this instance, compared to, say, the 2019 elections, where you've seen a greater interest in the elections than ever before. We might not have had a greater voter turnout, but we've had a greater interest in the elections and the outcome of the elections. What do you attribute that to?
Yeah, well,
is it purely on this basis that pundits were saying this election is about getting rid of the ANC?
Yeah, okay, let me just round up the point I was making, right? So I think, and I'll come back to what you're suggesting. So MK is that response to authoritarian populism because people are looking for an alternative. And that's, Trump in the US, it's Bolsonaro in Brazil, it's Duterte in the Philippines, and the list goes on and on and on. So again, we might be surprised by the support that Zuma got, but the impulse, the political impulse and the gravitation towards Zuma and MK is not at all surprising. Ibrahim, coming to your youth question, yes, greater interest in the elections. But one of the huge dilemmas we face is that, like youth around the world, 18 to 30 generally are not active in electoral terms. So let's just look at the numbers. We have under 30 about 11 point, let's say 5 million in terms of the electorate, and only about 4.5 million registered, right? But what we do know with young people is that when there might be electoral apathy, but when young people do register, they do tend to turn up. I haven't looked at what the current figures are, but we've reached as much as 70% previously of young people turning up, provided that they've registered. So yes, you're right, there's great excitement about turning up. And, I think to a large extent, those who registered would have turned up. But what, for example, doesn't give the EFF the support it claims to have is that its main electoral market, if you like, doesn't register and doesn't turn up. Well, turn up if they register, but doesn't register. And if they did, the EFF would arguably, I think, get a lot more support. The third point I'd like to make is there was a huge investment by white capital, particularly the Oppenheimers and others, in what I would call a section of liberal parties, right? Bosa, Rise Mzansi, and a few others. Change Starts Now initially. And what we've seen is those have been, if you like, a failure. Some would say a spectacular failure. Others might say, well, 2 seats in parliament for the start is a good showing. But I think by and large, that investment in those parties have not paid off. And the fourth point for me is how the media got it wrong, right? And I think particularly sections of the elite media that exercises such a huge influence on the national conversation. And I think what, very often if you read the Business Day or did the Daily Maverick, they gave copious and often very, fawning space to many of these liberal parties. And I think that showed that they were completely out of touch with the popular mood. And I think that's an important point to understand electoral politics in South Africa, right? There's a massive base at the social strata and a small elite at the top. Class is racialized. And of course, people were completely out of touch with the popular mood, including us as analysts, and may have not predicted that MK will get 40, 45% in KZN, and many of us said around 30%. Of course, I think there was one poll by ENCA that predicted it would get about 40%. So I think those are the important takeaways for me, particularly the unsurprising downward trajectory of the ANC.
So, Imran, that was at a national level. You've unpacked it at a more global scenario. But, the involvement of civil society, and Julius, I come to you on this here because that's your specialities in local government and citizen activism. We've seen a great deal of heightened civil activism. We've seen all this debate that has been taking place, many people talking about the different types of parties that have come around. You've seen the emergence of newer parties that seemed to attract a greater deal of younger and more urban voters, like your Rise Mzansis and the rest of them. How do you analyze that? What do you think has driven this particular sense of heightened civil activism in the political sphere?
Thanks, Ibrahim, and thanks the Chamber of Commerce, Manara Chamber of Commerce, for this event. You know what? I think Imran touched on it. People are not really so much in tune with politics anymore. It's really about keeping the electricity on. What's in it for me? Is the water flowing, and these kind of things. So I think new methods and ways of engaging with communities. And just if you look at what Rise Mzansi has done as an example, it's a bottom-up approach. They actually involved civil society, normal residents like you and I, to tell them who they want to vote for, created new, more innovative mechanisms. And I think that's quite attractive. I'm very curious to see what's going to happen at the local elections with this kind of methodology. But yeah, if you look at the new emerging politicking that's coming to the fore, you see also someone like Mandla Isaacs and Rise Mzansi, younger learned individuals who who almost have been mentored as youngsters with the ANC Youth League to an extent, and now they're emerging, using the new information and things to their disposal, understanding narrative economics, understanding how to use technology and AI. So I think that's going to be a big influence in the future of politics. It's interesting, and one has to ask the question: why still go stand in a queue to vote when we have technology at our disposal? And hopefully, these parties can also influence the way we vote in the future.
It's interesting because this afternoon I heard on a radio station, one of the callers called in and asked the presenter, what happens now to the mayors and the municipal managers in my town? Because we've come through this election, and will it make changes to the municipal managers and the mayors in my town? Now, this has been about national and provincial elections, and Imran has pointed out that the key issues, and you have also alluded to it, that the key issues are the potholes and the water. But is this going to make a difference to potholes and water?
Yeah, I think it will certainly have an influence. The coalitions that come out of this, taking a step back quick, talking about MK taking a lot of votes from the ANC. I deem it a faction that's left the ANC, and we'll see different coalitions going to the fore. We're all assuming what's going to happen. But if you look at the markets, which we'll touch on just now, things look quite stable and kind of positive. There's this hope, I think, that's lying ahead. And why I'm raising this, I think President Cyril Ramaphosa's hands been tied behind his back, and he's been in a bit of a fight and trying to keep everything at ease within the space of the ANC, and hopefully his hands are released now and they can do some proper action, whoever they go into coalition with. The reason I'm saying this is, on a national level, these coalitions will be very important on a provincial level. So they almost need to see how they can filter it through and influence local government. If you look at the city of Johannesburg as an example, it's chaos. We're seeing a lot of business disinvesting from the city and moving elsewhere. But the reason there is coalition politics, and no one from the province has really wanted to intervene with the national elections coming to the fore. But I think now the opportunity arises for them to turn things around and really shape the future of local government. They'll most likely have their sights on turning around municipalities come the next elections. And I think it's really crucial because they're starting to understand, like Imran's mentioned, that people I think people are just so overwhelmed with information and things these days, and under a lot of economic pressure, that you almost go to that Maslow hierarchy of needs. So when it comes to crime in your community, water, electricity, refuse, potholes, the school at your community, I think that's what's very important. And just to round it off, from an activism point of view, we've seen various organizations, with the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, which we work very closely with, Defend Our Democracy, having their sights on fair elections. I think what's very important now is to continuously foster these relationships amongst civil society, to start creating better transparency and more accountability. It doesn't matter who goes into these coalitions, so that we can hold each party through their own factions and their own voters to account. But we need to shape it up and step up a bit. I think that's very, very important for us in the next 2 to 5 years.
Well, one of the comments that has always been coming through prior to the elections was about load shedding. Just before the elections, we were 52 days without load shedding, and everyone was celebrating it. And there was this call that, or this thought that at 9 p.m. on the 29th of May, load shedding would start again the moment the last vote is cast. But we've seen 5 days later, we're still on no load shedding, and we touch wood and hold our fingers that this continues the trajectory. But does that intimate that we have no trust any longer in what government says?
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think that's what makes it attractive, you know, with the Rise Mzansis, and I'm highlighting Rise Mzansi in particular because they've focused a lot in the city of Johannesburg, where our head offices are, and I've engaged with some of them, and it's very interesting. I think people are hungry for real leadership, honest, transparent, real leaders. That's really what, if you look at the root cause of these problems, that's where it starts. And you know, if someone speaks and walks the talk, that's someone people want to follow. And what we're talking about a lot, and I see one of my colleagues from Action for Accountability was here, Yunus. Things need to start at grassroots level. You know, if you look at these kind of new politics that's happening, proof is in the pudding when it starts at local government. I think when people start seeing these leaders acting on what they're saying, and they know where they stay, they know where they are, and these people have really served them voluntarily, and their hearts are in it. I think people start believing in these leaders. But I think that the days of narrative economics and just persuading people through lies is coming to an end, hopefully soon. But I think what's also important is that communities need to get better organized, business needs to get much better organized, and start flexing its muscle to ensure that the political spheres or whoever is in power doesn't run roughshod over them. You know, it's particularly in KZN, if you look at what's happened there. You know, the harbour is a nightmare. The railways, just from an economic stimulation point of view, needs to be prioritized. And I think that's where the hope of businesses and engaging with the president before the elections has come from. So hopefully we'll see the private sector getting their hands dirty. But I almost want to say that it cannot stop there. We need to start looking at a co-governance kind of model, where us as the stakeholders or shareholders of our municipalities and government in itself really start participating much more than just voting. We need to almost on a monthly or quarterly basis have an influence or an overview on performance, and keep track of things, and where things don't happen, we need to challenge the powers that be, but also come to the party and help to bring up the solutions and fix things together.
Thanks, Julius. I just want to bring in Rashad at this point. Rashad, you know, Julius has just touched on the economics of the impact on the economy. And we've seen relative stability in the markets. Prior to the elections, there were a number of, even the ratings agencies and a number of financial institutions put out a stable outlook for the economy and for the country and for the elections. The markets haven't been so volatile. We've seen the Rand kind of dipped in the last few days, but it hasn't dropped to a significant level. We've seen this kind of stability. Is there some confidence in our country, in the economy, given that we are a very unequal society? We've got a great deal of inequality in the country, and there's this emphasis on business trying to work together with government to fix the issues that society faces. How do we look at the stability of our economy, the confidence that's been created? We've got this issue with the harbors, we've got this issue with the rails. We've seen some focus being put on it by the president prior to the elections in the February-March period when he met with business. Those have been highlighted to him. We've seen the fixing of Eskom load shedding under control. We've seen this kind of renewal. But has that translated into a broad confidence, and how is that going to impact on the business going forward?
Okay, so again, good evening and assalamu alaikum to yourself and to viewers or listeners, and thank you for the invitation. I think confidence, okay, let's just start with the first point. You spoke about the Rand not responding terribly negatively to what's happened over the past 2 or 3 days, or since last week, Thursday, when results started dripping in. I don't necessarily think this is confidence right now. I think it's just wait and see for what emerges within 14 days or whenever the new parliament elects the new president and the speaker and the cabinet is announced. And then you have more forward guidance on what the new cabinet and new policies are going to be. So you correctly point out that Cyril Ramaphosa and this administration has worked incredibly hard to address some of the key bottlenecks in the economy, which are probably shaving off 1, 2, 3% percentage points of growth. I mean, the economy has only grown about 0.8% on average annual basis over the past 12 years, which is terrible, much slower than population growth. And so as an economy, we have declining GDP per capita. So on average, we're getting poorer. And then once you look at that in terms of distribution analysis, your average wealthy South African, your top 5% is getting wealthier and the bottom 60% are definitely getting poorer, right? So not just on average, but it's definitely a regressive outlook and regressive performance over the past 10 to 12 years. So you've had that. In part, that poor performance is partially because of COVID, partially because of a global downturn in commodities and a downturn in the global economy. But we reached COVID with a very poor footing because of the state capture years and the hollowing out of institutions. In particular, you had the energy crisis, and both Julius and yourself have noted the challenges with port and rail. So logistics generally have been constraining growth. So the Zuma administration has been attempting, at least the last national administration has been attempting to address those. They've made, outwardly, it may not seem that impressive, but the reality is, given the political economy of making these decisions, addressing the issues with Transnet, lifting the cap on generation for IPPs, addressing some of the issues with the Durban container terminal, these are small steps that have been taken thus far, but the cumulative effect of these could unlock 1 or 2 or 3 percentage points of growth, and could also, boost confidence in the economy. Now, that project has been undertaken painstakingly by the Ramaphosa administration, right? So after the 2019 national elections, some of this got underway. This was accelerated, but it took a lot of internal convincing within the NEC of the ANC, right? Despite the opponents to it, and also despite the benefactors of state capture still being within the system, right? So it was a massive undertaking on the part of Ramaphosa, not to say that everything has worked out well and the wheels have moved fast enough. That has not been the case. Now, the outlook over here and why markets, in my view, and markets are not necessarily irrational, and there's a lot of hubris and a lot of bad information, still we'll need to see where this goes forward. Is this project of addressing energy and addressing logistics and making South Africa more business friendly and easy to do business, is this project going to continue? Is there a continuity of this policy trajectory, or is there an interruption of it and a discontinuity post 14 days after the announcement of elections around Youth Day? For that, and as Imran noted in the introduction, it's radically uncertain, whatever formation comes up. If you read the Sunday Times, if you read the Business Day, if you follow Twitter, there's suggestions of an ANC-DA in majority alliance or a national government of national unity, a GNU. It becomes very uncertain, right? Now, to speak of that is to also downplay the major ideological differences between the ANC and the DA, notwithstanding the EFF and the IFP, right? And there are major differences. If you go through the manifestos of the parties, certainly the ANC and the DA, there's a lot of alignment when it comes to macroeconomic policy, when it comes to the independence of the SARB, when it comes to fiscal policy and the need to continue consolidating despite it being quite painful for the poor majority of this country. There's alignment. At the same time, we know the ANC is a social democratic organization, broadly speaking. If there may be some deviations from that thinking in terms of ANC policy, but the ANC is a center-left organization for the most part of its history, right? And so as a consequence, you see an aversion to privatization. Privatization is forced upon the ANC. You see a very broad-based social grant system now with 17 million recipients of monthly grants with the COVID social relief of distress grant. And whereas with the DA, I would characterize as being center-right. And so while there is some policy alignment when it comes to economics and economic policy, it certainly favors a smaller state. It certainly isn't in favor of raising taxes. And so these are challenges that are going to emerge if this is a type of alliance that goes forward. And now to complicate matters even further, if we take the EFF's 260-page manifesto released about 7 weeks before elections seriously, it suggests a lot of policy contradiction between the ANC and the EFF, right? And so what then manifests after the fact remains to be seen. And so the markets are, in my view, waiting to look and see. I think confidence is quite tepid right now when it comes to the markets. You know, the rating agency having a neutral outlook, not a negative outlook. But at the same time, we are sub-investment grade when it comes to Moody's, when it comes to S&P, when it comes to Fitch, right? We have significant levels of debt, which are consuming an increasing share of revenue raised at the national level, right? So we have major challenges when it comes to the sustainability of the fiscus, right? So that's the business-friendly perspective. Now, the business-friendly perspective considers the importance of investment and considers the importance of continuing with business as usual to increase the potential for growth in the economy. Now, if we take a more than just a business-friendly perspective, what happens if the ANC proceeds with the DA alliance, excluding the EFF, excluding what may be considered a party that is closer to the ground? And how does the EFF, as Julius noted, what happens with the ANC and its support in a province like Limpopo, right? Which is not going to take well to an ANC-DA alliance, excluding other parties, right? So it may make sense nationally for business, but we also have to consider the ANC as a going concern in these other provinces. And of course, the most important one being KZN, where all bets may still be off right now. So I think going forward, there's radical uncertainty. We have the Reserve Bank penciling in 1.2, 1.4% growth for this year, not going beyond 1.8% over the next 3 years. That's insufficient. For this to improve, you need confidence, but that confidence needs to be borne out by some sort of political agreement, at the very least, at a national level. But this needs to be one that is also socially sustainable, not just fiscally and macroeconomically sustainable. And I don't think it's going to be socially sustainable if you don't have all provinces on the same page and you aren't able to maintain the social contract between the ANC and the population, which requires significant levels of social spending.
Well, interestingly, that in South Africa, we actually have a social compact that includes 4 partners. So you've got business, you've got government, you've got labor, and you've got civil society all together at the same time. And that's supposed to be the vision. You pointed out very correctly that each one of these parties in the coalition have a different view on the economy of the country. And so they might have different policies. The ANC has come out with a very centrist policy, looking at both the growth of the economy, growth of business, the well-being of society at the same time, and creating that support mechanism for the more affected, impacted part of society. So we've seen that over there. The coalition is not going to be about who's the great partner. It's about who's going to be able to sacrifice on the ideologies and the positions that they have. Wouldn't that be true, Imran?
Yeah, talking about the ideologies and positions and they have to compromise. That was your question, right?
Someone's going to sacrifice. So if it is, let's say, a ANC DA coalition, for argument's sake, the ANC and the DA have, as much as Rashad has pointed out, that there are some alignments in terms of the economic policy. But if we look at not the alignment of the policy, but in terms of which sector do they place higher on their, if you analyze the manifestos, which sector and issue are they playing importance on? So for instance, if I take the ANC has placed greater importance on the growth of the economy, whereas the DA has placed greater importance on sorting out crime and safety issue. Economy has come third. Who's going to sacrifice, and how do you manage the sacrifice of the ideologies and the importance that they give into the different sectors?
Yeah, thanks, Ibrahim. Let me say a few quick things, right? So one is, what are coalitions? Coalitions are about compromise, right? So yes, I hear your point. I would say the ANC has by and large adopted kind of conservative economic policy from the days of GEAR. But of course, the ANC also believes in state intervention and has done really well at issues of social welfare. South Africa has the most extensive social welfare on the African continent, and about 30% get some form of social welfare. Of course, the DA is on the other end. If you look at the recent 52-page document that I just had a glance through, it's neoliberal in nature, right? So one is it talks about a reduction in import tariffs as completely opposed to what the ANC would want. It talks about capping minimum wage and sort of curtailing minimum wage, the complete opposite of what the ANC wants. So yes, we get the point in terms of an approach to the economy, they're sort of diametrically opposed. In terms of foreign policy and the Middle East, again, they might be on different pages. But I don't think the DA and ANC necessarily need ideological synergy, right? What for me, someone who follows politics would be, is the challenge is how do you manage the contradictions, right? And the ANC has done well, maybe not so well historically at managing even intra-contradictions within the ANC. So if you look back at the ANC or the in power between 96 and about 2000, the latter part of Mandela's administration and the former part of Mbeki's administration, there was a neoliberal onslaught, right? You had Alec Erwin and others who were members of the Communist Party, but who were advancing privatization. Now that was, a huge contradiction that the ANC faced. And if you think back, there was a communist called Dale McKinley, and he was expelled from the Communist Party. And the first interview he gave to the media, and they asked him, why were you expelled from the Communist Party? And he said, I was expelled for espousing communism. And he was absolutely right? Because the conditions in the country had not allowed for him to talk about communism in the way he was doing it. So the point I'm making ultimately is that the ANC was able to manage those contradictions, maybe not really well. So even if there's a DA-ANC alliance, I think contradictions can be managed, right? I know that'll be good for the markets, that'll be good for business sentiment, etc. But it might not be the most popular decision. And of course, not everyone on the NEC are great cerebral thinkers. I mean, they're just there and they will, there are some important thinkers in the NEC, of course, not all of them. But I think what we need to think about the NEC is reading what the balance of forces are. And I think no one has a good sense of the balance of forces in the NEC are. I would suspect that there's a critical mass leaning towards the kind of social democratic faction of Ramaphosa that would be very open to a DA-ANC alliance. Of course, I think there would be another faction that would welcome an EFF alliance. And remember, while middle-class sentiment might be leaning towards, yes, we'd like to manage the contradictions despite the Middle East because the DA is a better option, the ANC-EFF alliance speaks to about 80% of the electorate, about 80% of the population. So of course the ANC does not want to reject, it can't go into dangerous territory where if it goes into this alliance with the DA, of course it wants to ensure that it doesn't alienate its electorate. So I think those are some of the dilemmas the ANC faces, and no one is able to tell which way they're going to go.
But in all of this here, it seems to have been about personalities, right? We've got the personality of Cyril Ramaphosa, and as you just pointed out, that the NEC would be around him. We've got the personality of Julius Malema. We've got the personality of John Steenhuisen and Helen Zille. You've got the personality of Jacob Zuma. There's this call, Julius, that Cyril Ramaphosa needs to be removed from the ANC in order for there to be some movement forward. How does that then impact on economic policy? Because he's come up with a varied stance on the economic policy of the country. We've had the sixth administration. We need to see a continuation of some of the policies and enhancement of some of the policies. The great thing about South Africa is we have all these fantastic visions and these different growth strategies, but we fail in the implementation part. How is that going to impact removal of Cyril Ramaphosa going to impact on economic policy?
Maybe just to
Yeah.
clarify, that's not Julius Malema's position anymore, right? He's not calling for Ramaphosa to be removed at all.
No. I didn't say it was Julius that was calling for it. I said our Julius Kleinhans answering the question.
Imran, you're welcome to jump in as well. No problem.
No, I guess it's the resemblance, Julius, that confused me.
It's very interesting. You know, I think the president has done a lot with business behind the scenes, and these new policies are quite attractive. You know, I think what he realized, well, he knows, is that we need this foreign investment. You need stability in the Middle East for our economy to thrive. We are dependent on exports and all these kind of things as well as imports. So I think it will have a significant effect if he was ousted. I find it difficult to see that happening, but I'm not a political analyst, so I won't really know. The question is, who will replace him? You know, I think that's
not who will replace him. What happens to economic policy? Rashad, you can jump in as well if
yeah,
you.
Please, Rashad. Yeah.
What happens to the continuation of the economic policy that Julius has just spoken about if Ramaphosa is removed from government?
Well, I think if Cyril Ramaphosa is removed from government, as the MK have said, they will only work with the ANC on the condition that Cyril is removed. It's not so much about Cyril, it's about the demands of the potential alliance partner. And the MK are avowedly anti-constitutional, based on recent statements. The MK in certain respects represent the fallout from the Zondo Commission, right? So those who were implicated and their accomplices are very much the leadership of Zondo. Of MK. The ones who emerged from Zondo are the leaders of the MK. And so in terms of what they would advocate for economic policy, it would obviously mean a loosening of the fiscal strings. It would be increasing or going back to some semblance of state capture, where you have this, this insatiable demand for more and more state resources to be captured by a small kleptocratic class of individuals, which what Zuma represented, but not purely Jacob Zuma. Many, even those unlinked to him, for instance, the capture of the coal value chain when it comes to Eskom. So I think we'll see a major discontinuity in a couple of respects. One is clamping down on state capture, tightening those bolts. Two is fiscal consolidation, which is what the Treasury has been trying to drive for the past 10 to 12 years, and they may see a fiscal surplus being realized and stabilization of the debt path over the next 2 to 3 years. And thirdly, as you mentioned earlier on, the reforms to utilities, in particular Eskom, Transnet, the ports, right, and rail. And so you'd see a major derailing of that. Derailing of that for two reasons. One is obviously the unbundling of Eskom has meant some level of private participation, which removes the potential for capture of value chains like we've seen in Eskom.
But that will be on the generation side, right? The transmission side will still remain within state.
That's correct, right? So the unbundling, that's primarily on generation when it comes to raw energy. And so I think it would derail this project on those three fronts. And there's also other smaller things that were going on when it comes to the procurement bill, when it comes to ensuring more transparency, when it comes to ensuring improved checks and balances when it comes to procurement. NHI is a bit of a red herring right now. I'm not sure where that falls because that was not necessarily a business-friendly signing in by Cyril Ramaphosa, but I think it's still early days on that front. So I think it would result in a major derailing, not because of Ramaphosa per se, but removing Ramaphosa implies about the alliance partner.
We've got a very varied audience, wide-ranging, different spheres, different scopes. And I'd like to then open up the floor to three questions from our audience, three pertinent questions from our audience. And I just want to point out that in our discussion today, we're not trying to predict what the coalitions would look like. And that's something that we wanted to stay away from, is predicting what the coalitions would look like or trying to advise on who should be in the coalition partners. And that's purely because these negotiations are still taking place. There's a lot of background considerations or discussions taking place in the behind closed doors. So we didn't want to touch on who the coalition partners would be, but just the implications in terms of the economics, because as a chamber, our concern is around the economy of the country, across the stability of business, the prospects of business going forward. The news that came out also, or a lot of the noise that we've seen on social media was about the potential of unrest, and yet we've seen statements come out of all the political parties calling for calm and peace. So we've seen an adherence to that over there. And that's the environment that we want to see, is the stable environment, the peaceful environment in which both business, society, and government can move forward. So let me open up for 3 questions. I'd like to suggest, if you want to ask a question, raise your hand, and we would allow you to ask a question. So whilst our audience is deciding about their questions, Imran, we've all spoken about, or there's been this analysis, this dearth of analysis around why the ANC lost its majority in terms of the kind of organizational issues that it had, the wariness of society towards the issues that they had faced under an ANC government. No one's talking about why there was this great move towards the MK. What was the compelling reason that we've seen this rise of the MK? Something must have compelled people to go towards MK. If I look at the 2019 infographic on the IEC website on the elections in KZN, and if I look at the colors that were showing out, you see that there was an ANC towards the interior and the rural areas. We've seen the coastal areas and the urban areas being DA, and we've seen a great deal of the IFP in the northern Zululand. Yet all of a sudden we've seen the swing where even the coastal and urban areas have gone towards the MK. What would you say was the compelling reason that people switched across so dramatically to the MK?
Yeah, Ibrahim, I thought I covered that at the start, but basically what I was saying is people are disillusioned with the political order, right? People continue to be living on the margins, facing the cruelty of poverty, unemployment, etc. And in that context, people look for alternatives. And very often those alternatives are what we call authoritarian or populist alternatives, right? The alternatives of, Zuma, for example, offering to be the savior. And of course, the figure of Zuma resonates significantly. There's a great political gravitas around Zuma. So I think Zuma is seen as the savior, and in the context that we find ourselves in, people will gravitate to Zuma. Like I said earlier, it's the same in the US, it was the same in Brazil with Bolsonaro, Duterte, and many, many other countries. People look for alternatives that may not make sense. MK doesn't offer much in policy terms, right? There isn't anything in policy terms. There isn't anything in the manifesto. The MK is essentially about its proximity to power, and it's about this avarice and its capacity to plunder the public purse. I don't see how service delivery is going to improve under the MK. It's not, but they remain a populist option. So I think that's the reason people will opt for MK, because there's complete disillusionment with the ruling party, and understandably so.
Julius, can I ask, Imran, did the traditional leaders have any influence under the MK? Because I know there's still a lot of that going on in KZN, and a lot of people submitting to those leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Zuma has great resonance, in many of the rural areas. But listen, this might be a sensitive and controversial point, but I think there's a huge ethnic element here. Our national politics, our provincial politics is descending into where an ethnic element becomes sexy. If you look at the Patriotic Alliance, it uses the kind of colored identity, and it gets more and more votes. If you look at the crazy guy in KZN, Karo Charo, he uses, he ethnic identity in order to garner votes. And I think Zulu nationalism is a big thing, right? It's been a big thing since the 1800s, interrupted by British nationalism. And but we've seen through the centuries, this kind of gravitation towards Zulu nationalism there. And I think Zuma has used it too. And it certainly has worked in his favor, despite the fact that his daughter and the others close to power might reject the idea that they're descending into some kind of ethnic enclave. I'd argue they certainly are.
What to our panel, what would be the key issues that a new government, Julius, I think you still have your hand up.
No, sorry, Ibrahim,
Oh, okay.
I'm fine.
Sorry, your
No,
hand's
thank you.
still up. Okay, what would be the key economic issues that a new government should focus on? Rashad, you spoke about sorting out the logistics and the infrastructure, but there are certain key issues. I mean, we've got this new partnerships that are taking place in terms of the way the world is changing, the new alliances that are coming about. We've got BRICS expansion, we've got the relationship that South Africa now has with the ASEAN countries. We've just been accepted as an observer into the ASEAN countries. We have these number of trading partnerships and trading blocks. So we're not leveraging it. It impacts on the economy, as Imran has pointed out. We've seen this dilution of our economy. But what should be the economic policies that a new government should focus on? Should it be, as some of the parties are called for in their manifestos, that is on the growth of the economy? Should it be on the sorting out the crime and safety issues? Should that focus be on creating greater stability and acceptance in society? There are certain key economic policies that talk to those over there. So maybe anyone want to take on that question, is that what are the key economic issues that a new government should focus on?
I don't mind responding to that. So,
I mean, Rashad, before we go to that, we've got a question from one of our audience. What's the difference between a coalition government and a government of national unity? I think that's a very important question. What's the difference between the two?
You want me to take it?
Yeah, Imran?
Yeah, I think there's a key difference. A coalition government is where, two or three parties might decide to collaborate, if you like. For example, we're talking about an ANC-DA coalition or an ANC-EFF or maybe +1 coalition. A government of national unity will be essentially what we've had already, right, in the first term under Mandela, where it was agreed that maybe you decide on the threshold, but there's an accommodation of all parties. And of course, there are some things that those parties need to subscribe to. For example, the allegiance to a constitutional democracy, the supremacy of the constitution, and then there might be a divvying up of the executive post. So it's essentially an accommodation of all of the parties, or parties above a certain threshold that would make up the GNU, or Government of National Unity, like we had F.W. de Klerk as the deputy president until the GNU collapsed.
Shaheen's asking, what's the worst case scenario for KZN from a political, economic, and social cohesion perspective, and conversely, the best case scenario or the most preferred scenario? So, Julius, I think you placed for that to take that question on.
No, sure. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think it depends on who you are, but from a business point of view, I've seen just on social media, the Secretary General of the IFP's already mentioned that they've rejected the coalition of the EFF and the MK. It will most likely be a IFP, ANC, DA kind of coalition in KZN. That would be the best. So the worst is the latter. We see MK having power. I think we've seen that on a national level already under the former president. And they're escaping all kinds of accountability. So yeah, I think that'll be the worst. And you know, one doesn't want to wish it or see it, but I think just the violence, political violence that we've seen in the province might also escalate in the next couple of months or so.
Okay, so
Can I add there, Ibrahim?
yeah.
Thanks for that, Julius. I'd say yes, of course, an alliance in KZN between the DA, the IFP, and what did we say? The ANC is possible. Leaving out MK. MK at 45, it is possible to leave them out, although I think that would be an extremely unwise decision and not strategic. It might be more appealing, more seductive, but I think having MK within the political establishment is safer than having them outside of the political establishment, right? And I think if you want to reject a party from the political establishment that has 45% of the support, that might be dangerous. And I think that could ignite, kind of unrest and unease. Of course, having the MK within the establishment is not the greatest scenario. We talk about liberation movements and breakaways having both democratic and authoritarian tendencies, and we've seen more authoritarian tendencies with MK. So I think we're going to get more of that. The other characteristic of these breakaways often are a very uneasy relationship with the constitution. And, this constitution is paramount for us in South Africa, despite what some on the right wing in the Muslim community might think of the constitution. But in terms of our well-being in the country, the constitution is really important. And MK has a very uneasy relationship with that constitution because it makes the argument that the constitution impedes development. And I think that's really, really worrying. But what do we do as the citizenry? I think South Africa has a really sophisticated architecture for participatory democracy, right? Electoral participation is not where the democracy ends. So if you think about constitutionally, legislatively, and policy terms, people are allowed to participate in the democracy, from talking to your councillor to sending a petition to participating in the portfolio committee meeting at national level and provincial level. Civil society, taking part in processes of the state. So I think all of those will need to be advanced. And of course, a strong opposition that you need to have in KZN. So I don't think all is lost. I do think in the future, the longevity of a party like MK is not guaranteed. Right? Breakaway parties that are formed without any solid policy background, etc., I don't think are going to last long. I could be wrong. The party is built largely around the persona of Zuma. And I think in the future, that party could easily fade away.
Imran, I can give you an entire hour and it won't be sufficient in unpacking this analysis. And we're heading towards the end of our program. I'd like to ask Solly Suleiman, the president of Minara Chamber, just for a 1 minute input or a 30-second input into the conversation. Solly?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah, thanks for the enlightening program this evening. And I think, when I listen to what Imran has to say, I think that's important. I think the MK has to be the governing party in KwaZulu-Natal for us to have a, relatively stable process here, because there's no way they'll accept all the minority parties from getting together and creating a government of KZN. So that would be the best case scenario for MK to be the government, not the best government, but at least something that will allow for a certain amount of stability. But Jazakallah, thanks. I think it's exciting times. I think the important aspect is people are getting very concerned and worried and whatnot. But I think South Africa has proven to be a country that kind of rises from the ashes, and if one can say that, and inshallah we hope there's opportunity within the challenges that we have, and I'm quite optimistic. I don't, as Imran said, I don't think it's a surprise that the ANC lost its majority because people have been dissatisfied for quite a long time, and any party that appeals to the masses and appeals to people's basic requirements definitely would have gain the type of momentum, and of course the charisma of the MK leadership, especially Zuma, made a difference. So that's Jazakallah. Thank you very much to the listeners as well as to our guests that have come on board at short notice. And I think it's very interesting, and I'm sure there'll be more discussions in the next couple of weeks. It's interesting.
Thanks, Salih, for that. And I think that sums it up in a nutshell. That we focused on the wheres and the hows of the politics and the elections. But the key issue is that we need to look at not just the coalitions and who are the best partners, but in the interests of the country, we need to look at what is the partner that brings stability. And that would be the compelling argument in terms of the coalitions, is that where does the stability come from? And I think that is the key and important issue, particularly in KZN. I want to thank Imran Bacchus, Rashad Amra, and Julius Kleinhans for being on the program with us this evening and for unpacking a great deal. I think some of the questions we didn't get a chance to delve into, but we'll take those up at another point. Thanks to our audience. And we've just come through a very severe storm in KZN. I wish everybody safe, and our thoughts and prayers go out to all those that are affected. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh from the Minara Chamber of Commerce, and thank you for being with us this evening.